Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Joshua Bay, an education reporter with the 74, a nonprofit news organization covering America's education system from early childhood through college and career. Joshua's coverage spans from artificial intelligence in the classroom to Gen Z's growing apathy toward a college education. With support from his fellowship at the Poynter Institute, Joshua produced a three-part project taking a closer look into the struggles of earning a bachelor's degree, particularly among community college transfers. And he joins us today to talk about the study and what higher ed institutions need to do to improve the student experience. Joshua, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Drumm.
My pleasure. I am looking forward to our conversation. You just recently wrapped up a three-part project looking at the struggles of earning a bachelor's degree, really focused on first-gen students. Before we get into that, I'd like to hear a little more about your background. This is a fascinating topic, and how did you get into journalism?
Yeah, definitely. And as you had mentioned, my name is Joshua Bay, and I'm an education reporter for the 74. A lot of my coverage spans from youth mental health to artificial intelligence in the classroom to Gen Z's declining college interest. Prior to the 74, I was a graduate student at Georgetown University where I studied educational transformation, focusing in on advocacy and policy. I was also an alum of the University of La Verne where I studied public affairs. So that's a lot, where my journalism, my communications background came from. And as you had mentioned about my three-part project that I did for the 74, I'm actually an alum of the Poynter Koch Media and Journalism Fellowship Program. And it was through that fellowship with the Poynter Institute and Stand Together that I was able to produce that project that took a closer look into the struggles college students face to earn a bachelor's degree.
Mm-hmm. You've got me curious. I've never heard a name like the 74. How did the publication get its name?
Yeah, so I tend to get asked that question a lot. A lot of people are a little bit confused about the name the 74. And so when the 74 was first found, there was about 74 million children in the United States. So the 74 is pretty much taking a nod to those children in the United States.
That's pretty neat. At least it's not titled the 1.7 billion, which has to do with the amount of debt out there right now.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, we'll definitely find ourselves changing the name depending on which students we're referring to or which children we're referring to.
There we go. Flexibility, they say, is the key to success. So that's important.
Yeah, definitely.
Anyway, struggles of earning a bachelor degree. Why was this topic so important to you?
Yeah, I mean, the struggles of earning a bachelor's degree is something that's just so prevalent right now, especially when we're talking about first-generation students, when we're talking about students of color, low-income students. Gaining that economic and social mobility is such an important topic right now, especially within education. So when I had that opportunity through my fellowship with the Poynter Institute and Stand Together to really take a deeper dive into this topic, I definitely jumped right on it, was able to produce that three-part project. The first looking into just undergraduate enrollment, the second looking at bachelor's degree completion rates, and then the third really taking that in-depth look at students who represented that there is this really important and integral struggle that's happening within college students that continues to prevail even up until today.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the things that you found in this study? I'm sure we could talk 2 hours on the total of it, but just a summary of what you found.
So for my first article, I took a deeper dive into undergraduate enrollment data. And it was through that I found that community colleges led overall growth in the fall of 2023, but those enrollment gains were carried by community colleges with a vocational program focus. Also, fewer community college students were transferring to four-year institutions, especially when we were looking at pre-pandemic numbers. And then my second article took a look at bachelor's degree completion rates. And we're looking at this data that only about 1/3 of community college students ended up transferring to a four-year school, and less than half of them graduated within 6 years. So we're looking at about 16% end up getting that bachelor's degree, with even lower completion rates from Black students, Latino students, and low-income students. And then my third article, as mentioned earlier, was really taking an in-depth look at the trials and tribulations of three students in particular. The first student was a community college student who grew up in Mexico. The second student was an older student who managed to transfer to a four-year school. And then the third student was someone who ended up leaving their college program to start his own business.
Mm-hmm. That sounds like a very comprehensive project. Let's focus in a little bit on the second portion of that. Those students transferring from community college to a four-year institution. It sounds like they've had some challenges, especially with the 16% completion rate.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of challenges, particularly for community college transfers and their success rates at those four-year institutions. I mean, there's definitely a bunch of different things that we can go into and about why that ends up being the case. But ultimately, one of the things that I've found through my research and chatting with other researchers and advocates is that oftentimes these university actors aren't necessarily well equipped to deal with the many different needs of these students.
Okay. That's an interesting and pretty provocative statement, which I'm fine with. I think you're right. My sense is probably there aren't a lot of scaffolding in place to help these transfer students. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's definitely a fair statement. And I guess continue the point that I was making earlier, like, do I believe that higher education institutions are particularly listening to their students or paying attention to the needs that they need to be successful? I think the short answer is no. But the long answer is that it really varies depending on which colleges and college actors we're referring to.
Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting statement that colleges aren't listening. I would suggest there's probably that piece that they probably don't know the right questions to ask, but also knowing what I know, and you do as well, first-gen students are really hesitant to say what they need, or they don't know because they've never been in that situation.
Yeah, definitely. I think everything you had just said right now is like right on the nose about the experience of first-generation students. Let's just set the foundation, right? And let's call a spade about who first-generation college students are as we go into the issues that they face in the higher education system. First-generation students are often students of color, and they often come from lower income backgrounds. And from this, first-generation students are often the first in their families to navigate college admissions, financial aid, and post-secondary coursework. And because of this, as you had just mentioned, you'll often find them hesitant to say what they need, or they may not even realize what they need to be a successful student.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a few colleges who get it right, but the majority really don't.
Yeah, and I guess to go back to what I was mentioning earlier, it definitely varies depending on which colleges and college actors we're referring to. From previous articles that I've written for the 74 and past research, I found that community colleges, one, have historically served a great number of first-generation students. And because of that, I've seen some pretty great strides on their end to ensure that those interested in transferring to a four-year institution and that are interested in getting that bachelor's degree are being guided along the way. But once those community college transfers get to that four-year institution, a lot of that guidance they received at their local community college often goes down the drain, which is very concerning because research shows that having a bachelor's degree is the best pathway to improve our social and our economic mobility. So when these students hit these roadblocks at four-year institutions, I guess just to sum it all up, it shows that these university actors aren't necessarily listening to their needs.
Mm-hmm. And when we talked before, we talked about guided pathways reform and how important that was in community colleges. Tell us a little bit more about that, if you would.
At the community college level, reforms such as the guided pathways model have been very helpful. And for those who are unfamiliar with guided pathways, it's an advising model that rooted from the Community College Research Center at Columbia University that many community colleges across the country have, that pretty much creates this individualized plan for students to schedule classes and monitor progress. So for instance, let's just say we have a student who's entering community college and they're really interested in getting a bachelor's degree in communications. So through the guided pathways model, once they enter in their community college, their advisor would pretty much develop the entire plan for them, from all the classes they would need to take at that community college to also all the classes they would need to take at that four-year institution, so they can end up earning that four-year degree. As they're taking those classes, their progress is also being monitored and they're being given really great advising along the way. But as transformational as this has been for community college students and community colleges, it only moves the needle a little bit, because community colleges don't necessarily decide which credits will end up transferring, or even if the student will get admitted to that university to begin with. That's where I really am hoping to really emphasize that four-year schools need to grasp that transfer students and transfer policy is a complex public higher education issue rather than this isolated community college problem. And the more that we can think of it in that way, the more we're able to help all kinds of students, especially first generation students, students of color, and low income students.
Mm-hmm. Well, what you're talking about to me reminds me of something that David Decker at Franklin University has done a really phenomenal job with, is articulation agreements, understanding what credit hours will transfer to his university, et cetera. Because Franklin is an online degree completion university, and they do a phenomenal job at what they do. When someone applies, they have articulation agreements and they have curriculum mapping from over 1,200 different community colleges across the country, so that when a student applies, they know right off the bat how much the credits are going to apply to the degree. There's other states who mandate that transfers from the public community colleges, the credit have to be accepted. And they've even gone as far as to say the course numbers are the same across the state. Those are all things I would think are helpful.
Yeah, definitely. They're very helpful when these public four-year colleges have those relationships, have those partnerships with their local community colleges. But depending on which colleges and which states we're referring to, don't necessarily always happen. When I think about this topic, I think about a conversation that I had with two researchers about their forthcoming book, where they looked at the issues with community college transfers. And the one thing that they had mentioned to me that really stuck was the, quote, gatekeeping practices that they observed at the four-year institutions that they were looking at. This is not to say that university actors have ill will, but this idea of gatekeeping is often them trying to maintain the rigor of the programs at their respective university. And you would think this would happen at your quote unquote prestigious universities like a Harvard or a Yale, but this actually happens at public four-year schools, and many of them across the country, who ultimately should be viewing themselves as part of that public higher education ecosystem just as much as their local community colleges, are exhibiting that in ways that you had described in your examples about partnering with their local community colleges to ensure that students who enter that community college have that really smooth pathway of they enter community colleges and they know exactly which classes that they're going to be taking so they can be successful at whatever public four-year school that they want to transfer to.
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, I've seen this when it comes to accreditation as well. Mm-hmm. You'll have many higher ed institutions who are accredited by the, quote, former regional accreditors. Now everyone's known as an institutional accreditor. Mm-hmm. And they would not accept credits from schools who are accredited by the former national accreditors. They felt like the accreditation was less superior, and therefore it was a way of gatekeeping so that they could stress their exclusivity, their rigor. Mm-hmm. I always was curious about that, because the way that I learned was if you're accredited, you're accredited, but that's not the way it happens.
Yeah, it's like sometimes it can be like a little bit confusing, right? For all
Hmm.
actors within these college spaces, from students, from advisors, from faculty, to really understand like what exactly does it mean to have a rigorous course? What exactly does it mean to create this community college course that will end up transferring to whatever public four-year school a student really wants to transfer to? And because of those, I guess you could say, these unique policies that can end up being a little bit different from institution to institution, it can be really hard to manage, especially, again, for advisors to be able to give really good guidance to their students and for students to ensure that the classes that they're taking will end up being viewed as rigorous as the right class to count at that four-year school. And this can definitely be a really tough pill to swallow, especially for states that prioritize institutional autonomy and decentralization. But research shows that centralized policies, especially centralized transfer policies, are very beneficial for students and especially for these local community colleges. Because when you have these decentralized policies, and again, these various rules and policies at these four-year institutions, it often puts a lot of that burden on historically marginalized students and families to figure out the complexities of the higher education system, which again, it puts a lot of burden on those first generation students who may not necessarily have the social capital, who may not necessarily have that community of people who have gone through this system before to be able to give them the right guidance. And the last thing we want is for these community college students, these first generation community college students, to take these classes to learn all of these amazing things just for them a year or two later to realize it was wasted time, wasted effort because that credit didn't count at that four-year school.
Hmm. And a lot of wasted money as well.
Yeah, and a lot of wasted money too. And again, when we're thinking about community college students and first generation community college students, they often come from lower income backgrounds and lower income families. So every dollar really counts for them to ensure that they're able to, succeed and get that socioeconomic mobility that they're searching for by getting that bachelor's degree.
Hmm. So, what are some of the things that higher ed institutions currently do to make their institutions welcoming to the first gen students, and especially these transfer students from community colleges? I know there's good stories out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it always goes back to the idea of creating that community, one, and also that sense of belonging for those students. When we really look at the demographics of students entering these four-year institutions, they don't necessarily follow that traditional pathway that we're used to seeing students at four-year schools, right? Stories that we read online from books through TV shows, etc., show that students who become freshmen at these four-year institutions are straight out of high school and then they immediately go and become a freshman at this four-year institution. But nowadays, it's not necessarily the case, right? The demographics of students, they look like that student who went to community college first and then transferred to a four-year institution, right? They look like students who took a gap year or many years after high school to decide what they wanted to do with their life before they ended up enrolling into a four-year institution. They look like that student who maybe they entered into a community college or a four-year institution, decided to leave, and then came back a little bit later in life once they felt prepared. So we're not only seeing the demographics of students at these four-year institutions racially, but also through their own life experiences, their own lived experiences, right? And being able to acknowledge that, being able to get on the nose with that, and to be able to create that sense of community and sense of belonging is very important for these four-year institutions to do, to ensure that as their student demographic is becoming so diverse, that they're also creating programs and policies that ensure that those students who end up enrolling stay at their institution.
Are we seeing, since the pandemic or post pandemic, are we seeing far more pathways to entry into college than we used to? I mean, it seems like it to me, but what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that pathway into a four-year institution is looking so different for different kinds of students. They can be entering in through that community college, getting that guidance first, and then going to their four-year institution. They can have a community of people, whether it's friends or family, who have gone through that system before that help them find that pathway into the four-year institution. Or you have students who enter into community colleges that don't necessarily even want that four-year degree. They just want that associate's degree or that on-the-job training or that vocational pathways so they can get into the workforce immediately, which is a trend that we're seeing a lot, especially with young students, with Gen Z students. So we're definitely seeing this really diverse thought process from young folks on how they want to achieve their goals in life, whether it does involve a bachelor's degree or not. So yeah, so there's definitely a lot of diversity when it comes to that.
Mhm. And with those multiple pathways, to me, it puts the onus on the institutions to have varied experience, people who can talk to in the enrollment process, can talk to the various pathways. But instead, the pre-pandemic way of doing things was it's up to the student to figure it out. And that doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, definitely. I think you bring up a really great point. And I think that's why at the community college level, that guided pathways model is so transformational for those students because it not only helps those students, particularly first generation students who may not necessarily know the right steps to get that bachelor's degree, it helps them figure out those classes. It helps them also have advising along the way, not necessarily like maybe like once or twice a semester, but they're being guided and their progress is being looked at along the way, which isn't necessarily a model that's being exhibited at public four-year schools, or they may have different variations of it, but it's not really this like centralized thing that's happening at these public four-year schools.
Mm-hmm. Well, it makes sense if the advisors are trained and understood to be able to help students coming from various pathways, that they could be more successful. But it's not just the advisors. I think it's also the enrollment folks. It's the faculty understanding the different ways that students come in and them staying involved with it as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I think that all makes sense. There's so many different actors within these university spaces that all contribute to not only like admitting various types of students, but also ensuring that they make it to that completion. And that always goes back to that sense of belonging, that sense of community that these institutions are creating for their students. What are they doing not only to help students, but to make sure that these students know that they are on the right path, that they are taking the right classes, that they aren't wasting their money and their time, and they're learning something, and that there's going to be outcomes at the end when they get that degree. And by outcomes, we're talking about, is there going to be a job at the end of this degree that's going to give them a family sustaining wage and going to be something that's going to, again, help their economic mobility?
Mm-hmm. In doing these articles that you have, you interviewed quite a number of students. I think you mentioned 3 for your third article. What were some of the stories that you heard that talk to these points that you've been making?
Yeah, those 3 students gave such a diverse and such a unique set of stories that really speak to the stories of many students that are entering college right now. I think one story that really stuck out to me was from Benjamin Gregory. So Benjamin Gregory was the student he was the older student that was navigating his transfer pathway. He initially enrolled into a 4-year institution right after high school. And he, as he liked to say, he wasn't necessarily focused at the time on his courses. And instead he felt like he was focused on getting a quote PhD in partying. And because of that mentality, he ended yeah, he was very funny. Yeah. And because of that mentality, he ended up leaving his school, going straight into the workforce, realized that, going into the workforce without a degree wasn't necessarily something that he wanted for himself, then ended up enrolling into a community college and then transferring to a 4-year school. And today he's actually getting his doctorate at that same 4-year institution, which is super amazing for Benjamin. But one of the things that he had shared with me is that, especially since he followed that pathway of first community college, then a 4-year institution, and now a doctorate at that same 4-year institution, was the mindset and the mentality of different professors at these different institutions. One of the things that he had said was a lot of the reasons why he was able to be so successful at that 4-year institution was because of how amazing the professors at his community college were. His professors were very attentive. They were making sure that he was progressing in the courses just as much as his advisors and other actors within the community college space were. And then once he went to his 4-year institution, that's kind of where that attention that he was used to at that community college didn't necessarily go away, but they just weren't as attentive as he was used to when he was at that community college. And the one thing that he had mentioned was that he believes that it's because professors at community colleges, like, that's their only job at the community colleges, is to be a professor and to teach the students. So they were a lot more excited. They were a lot more attentive of every single student and where they were starting from, versus at a 4-year space, there's oftentimes a lot of professors who are juggling a bunch of different things, right? They're not only teaching, but they're also doing research. They're also doing other projects within their university. So sometimes that teaching becomes secondary or even tertiary to all the things that these professors at 4-year schools are managing. But because of that, that ultimately creates that deficit in what that student at that 4-year school really wants to get out of the course that they're taking at that school.
That's phenomenal. Someone starting off at a 4-year, dropping out, going back to community college, and then ending up with their PhD. I'm just curious, what is he studying and what will he do his dissertation on? When will he graduate?
Benjamin is studying, I'm trying to remember right now. He's very, like, he was always very into engineering, and he's getting his doctorate currently in chemical engineering. So he's very much like in the laboratory. He wants to be a scientist and wants to do all of, those amazing things.
Yeah. Now he's going to go into research and forget about the students. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, that's a really funny point. But, the hope is that because he had those experiences, he knows once he maybe does inevitably become a professor or decides to teach a little bit later in life, that the role that he plays at that 4-year school as a professor can be really transformational for those students, depending on the amount of effort that he puts in.
I remember the first accreditation visit that I ever went on. The director of the school came up, and his cultural bias was kids don't care about how much you know until they know how much you care.
Mm-hmm.
And that is so critical nowadays. Yeah, faculty are pulled in multiple directions, but frequently, if they just take the time to spend time with students, to get to know them, it is that one person that makes all the difference in the world. I remember I jokingly say I had a technical training because I majored in physics at the Naval Academy.
Mm-hmm.
Regardless, I think back to my time at Navy, and it was the one faculty member who made a difference, who took me aside when I was struggling and was like, yeah, you can do this. Here's
Mm-hmm.
what you need to do, etc. And it made all the difference in the world.
That story you had shared just really speaks to how transformational educators can be, and especially in that higher education space, especially when we're thinking about the social and economic mobility of students trying to get that bachelor's degree. A lot of them do say and have shared with me that a lot of the reasons why they say was because they had that professor, because they had that one person at that space that made them feel like they belong there, that no matter where they were starting out from, especially when we are talking about first generation students, and we are talking about students of color, when we are talking about these lower income students, that they had those professors that saw them, that really understood who they were as people and the value that they brought, not only to the class that they were taking, but to the institution as a whole. For instance, especially with bans on affirmative action, I really think that there's a lot of entrance convergence for these public 4-year schools to continue to remain committed to diversity efforts at their school, again, by partnering with their local community colleges and ensuring that they're providing that top-notch, that top-level experience for these students who really want to be there and really want to learn, but they just want to make sure that they feel like they belong in that higher ed community.
And higher ed needs to remember that we're here to help transform people from whatever walk of life they come. And when we think about that, what's that saying? No person is greater when he helps than when he helps someone and lifts someone up who couldn't get there themselves. I mean, that's our role.
Exactly.
So, Joshua, thank you. I so much appreciate your taking the time, and I wish you all the best there at the 74. I'd love to hear more about your future articles at another time, but as we always do when we wrap up, what are 3 takeaways for university presidents and boards? What do they really need to know that came out of your research about listening to students and how to make them successful?
First and foremost, thank you so much, Drumm, for having me on your podcast. This has been such a lovely conversation, and I'm always super happy to talk about the research that I've done and the articles that I've written for the 74, and even prior research that I've done before the 74 on college students, on community college transfers. To your point about 3 takeaways for university presidents, I think the first would be there is some value in centralizing these policies, especially when it comes to transfer policies, which again can be a tough pill to swallow for states that prioritize decentralization and autonomy. But when you do prioritize that decentralization and autonomy, it often puts a lot of burden on first generation students to figure out the complexities of higher education that they may not necessarily have that social capital that other students that may have a community or family that have gone through the process to know and to understand. So centralization really helps kind of like even that playing field, right? The second would be, again, especially with bans on affirmative action for public four-year schools that remain committed to diversity, there is a lot of interest convergence to achieve this by partnering with your local community colleges that often and historically have served first-generation students of color, and lower income students. And then third, once these students end up being entered into your school, we need to remember and acknowledge that the makeup of the students are more diverse than ever, both racially and also through their lived experiences. So really rethinking ways to create that sense of belonging and community for all types of students at your school is very important.
Thank you, sir. Wise beyond your years. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it.
So what's next for you? What's the next series of articles you've got?
That's a great question. I mean, I actually have a Q&A publishing soon at the 74 on the 2 authors I had mentioned earlier that took a closer look at community college transfers. I pretty much chatted with them about their book. It was a 6-year study of more than 100 community college students and their findings from those community college students. And their insights were just so incredible, Drumm. And I'm so excited to share their insights and what they shared with me to our audience at the 74.
That'll be great. I look forward to reading about it. Joshua, thank you so much for being on the program. I look forward to the next time we get a chance to talk.
Okay, perfect. And thank you again, Drumm. This has been amazing.
My pleasure, sir. Take care.
Okay, take care.
Thanks for listening, and a special thank you to Joshua Bay for joining me today. Joshua, thank you. It was a pleasure having you on the show, and I look forward to having you back to talk about future articles. Join me next time when I welcome Lauren Zalaznik to the program. Lauren is an author, publisher, board director, and strategic advisor. You may not recognize Lauren's name, but she's had an exceptional career transforming the cultural landscape. She's received 2 Peabody Awards, numerous Emmy Awards. Time magazine has named her one of the Time 100 World's Most Influential People. Lauren recently released a new book, Letters from the Corporation of Brown University, Lives of Usefulness and Reputation, and will be joining me to talk about the learnings from this unique glimpse into the evolution of the institution's enduring traditions and how they help inform our perspective on the range of issues which face most universities today. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.